fancy introductions because we figure that we'd like to most hear what you have to say.
That's great. I really like that, actually. So let's plunge right in. I'll just say thank you very much to the organizers and to the NSF for making this happen. I think it's a really, great event and a great opportunity to think a little bit about topics that for me are actually not the kinds of topics that are usually at the forefront of my research. So all in all, I think this workshop is a bit like a huge puzzle where everyone is trying to bring different pieces and we're trying to see how they fit together. And the particular sort of puzzle piece that I'm bringing to the table is inspired by joint action research. So joint actions are actions that we perform together with others to achieve common goals. And they normally involve coordination in time and space. Often they have a practical purpose. For instance, a car needs fixing, a patient needs surgery, or there's this heavy bowl of salt that needs to be handed over. There are also many joint actions that have an artistic quality to them and generate particular experiences in the people who are engaged in them, but also often in spectators. And then finally, I think it's important to keep in mind that we also have joint actions that aren't so much performed for the sake of doing something together, but actually for the sake of teaching and learning. So there are many contexts of instruction where we learn from others by doing things together, but the ultimate goal is actually a transmission of individual skills. Now, what's intriguing about joint action, I think, is its jointness. So here's an old quote by Woodworth that maybe some of you are familiar with. And I just went back to this and I thought, oh, it is so fitting, I have to put it there again. So two boys between them lift and carry a log which neither could move alone. You cannot speak of either boy as carrying half the log, nor can you speak of either boy as half carrying the log. The two boys coordinating their efforts upon the log perform a joint action and achieve a result which is not divisible between the component members of this elementary group. So, I think this kind of jointness has a lot to do with the jointness of the result. And I think it would be a mistake to conclude that you always have to study a dyad as a unit or even a larger group as a unit. I think it makes perfect sense to look at individual level cognitive processes and try to specify these and try to say, what is going on inside of individual minds as people are engaged in a joint action. But at the same time, of course, we need to keep in mind that people are always part, of an unfolding joint action that has its interaction dynamics. And often there are these kind of joint outcomes that really are not divisible. So that was sort of my starting point for trying to think about this particular question of how joint action may contribute to augmenting individual cognition. And as I said before, that's not really something, I've directly studied. So I sort of thought that's an interesting challenge and kind of like a homework for me to try and find some answers here. That sort of tried to make this link between joint action research and this idea of augmenting individual intelligence or individual cognition. And so today I'd like to talk about three different aspects or three different ways in which joint action could play a role here. The first is that it may play a role by expanding our space of imaginable action possibilities. So as I already said, joint actions often lead to outcomes individuals could not achieve alone. And we also know that people actually plan their actions in a joint action with regard to joint outcomes. So music is a domain where you can imagine this very easily, right? You're just doing one part, but you can imagine the whole outcome. And in fact, often you need to do so in order to do a good job. Empirically, we also have some evidence for this. So we have some evidence that people are planning actions with regard to joint outcomes. Here's just one study I briefly want to talk about. This is a study where we had pianists coming into the lab and they played duets that they had practiced at home. And they were at the level where they could play these pieces perfectly. But what we did is we actually inserted violations. So every now and then when they pressed the correct key, we would nevertheless play the wrong note back to them. It's kind of nasty, but we told them in advance so they knew this was going to happen. Now, why did we do that? We did that because we wanted to know how they would respond to violations, not just in their own part, but also in their partner's part. So this is a way of finding out to what extent are they forming expectations about something that should be done by their partner. And in addition to that, using music also made it possible for us to manipulate whether or not the joint outcome was violated. And that we did through the harmony. So there were instances where playing the wrong note back to them meant that the joint harmony was still preserved. So overall, you could say that at some level, the joint outcome was still the way it should be, even though not exactly. And in other cases, the violation was such that the joint harmony was violated. And importantly, we made sure that whenever the joint harmony was violated, it wasn't musically unexpected. It didn't sound, nasty or ugly or anything like that. If anything, it was musically more expected, because we really wanted to rule this out as a potential confound. And this was an EEG study. So we measured electric brain activity to see the response to these violations. And there are two well-known components, an early and a late one. The early one is about registering a violation. The later one is about the evaluation of it. And what we saw is that at an early stage, all kinds of violations were registered. So people had ideas about what they should be hearing, and they noticed any kind of mistake or violation in this case. So this is known as the FRN. It's an early event-related potential that's been studied a lot and shows up whenever you detect a violation. More interesting are the results for the later component. This is about how you evaluate an error. And what we see there is that people care more. So higher positivity here means a stronger response to the violation. People care more when the error has been in their own part compared to when it has been in their partner's part, but they still notice it. And importantly for our purpose here, they care about whether or not the joint harmony was violated, and the strongest response is in those cases where it was violated. So this tells us they're not just planning their own part and the other's part in isolation, and they're not just making predictions about their own notes and the other person's notes, but they're really considering what it is that they're going to produce together. And this is sort of in the foreground as they're monitoring the performance, and is probably also driving their planning processes. So taking this principle, we can think about domains in which this could be useful and ways in which this could actually affect individual minds. So if you think about a conductor, for instance, I think this is clearly a case where you have an individual person who needs to consider joint outcomes, and often also needs to compare the actual performance of an orchestra with their imagined performance to give appropriate feedback to the musicians in order to get the actual performance closer to what they have in mind. Or if you take a composer, they would write down something that applies to a whole group of people, and they would be able to imagine it. But at the time where they're doing this, they are, of course, on their own. And then there are certainly many creative contexts where people are acting together, and their actions are constrained and guided by these joint action outcomes. So I think there is, maybe not a lot of research on this yet, but it's definitely something to be explored about this link between being able to imagine joint outcomes and these creative activities. And likewise, I think this process or this principle of considering joint action outcomes could also play a role in problem solving. So if you imagine, for instance, you're confronted with a situation where you need to pass this stream, you could, of course, think about, what you could do individually to get across it without getting wet. But you could also think about it from a joint action perspective. And that might be more salient when other people are around you. But I think in principle, you can also do this when you're on your own and then decide to go and recruit people. So here, our ability to imagine a joint outcome could also drive our problem solving. And there's also a link here, I think, to research on joint affordances. So of course, the environment also provides a guiding role here. And we know, for instance, from Mike Richardson's work, that people have this ability to perceive properties of objects, not just in terms of, what kind of action they could be performing on their own, but in terms of what it means for a group. So for instance, if you see a long plank coming down a conveyor belt, then you would lift it together. And so, going beyond just the perception of affordances, you could argue here that people can also imagine all kinds of joint affordances, and that could in turn drive their problem solving. So that was the most speculative part. And now I'm turning to a part where we have a little bit more evidence. So another aspect, another way in which joint action can augment individual cognition is through people adopting different perspectives. And that's something that's quite common in joint action. We often have a different perspective on things, both literally and more metaphorically speaking. So to go for a literal example, consider a situation where you're trying to put up a Christmas tree in such a way that it's totally straight. It's actually not an easy task. And the reason for that is that if you're looking at it, you have good accuracy on your left-right dimension. You know when it's straight on the left-right axis, but it's very difficult to do this in terms of depth perception. So you don't actually know whether it's tilted towards you or away from you. And the only way to know is to walk around it. So you take a 90-degree angle, and from that perspective, you can of course see it because it's your left-right axis again. So that's a kind of situation where you might naturally work with someone else to put up this tree in a straight manner. And when you look at the literature, there's of course lots and lots of evidence that people indeed can integrate their judgments, and that these judgments then, improve compared to individual judgments. Often it's just simple aggregation, as in wisdom of the crowds effects. Sometimes there is a more nuanced integration. For instance, Bahadur Bahrami's work has nicely shown that when people communicate about their confidence, this can lead them to more appropriately weigh others' input. And so the more competent individual ends up having more influence. But here we wanted to know whether, even if you're not communicating, does having complementary perspectives in a shared environment allow you to have a benefit from collaboration? So we really tried to get the Christmas tree example sort of turned into an experiment. We didn't show people Christmas trees, but just cuboids where they had to locate a pointer above a circular target. In the actual experiment, the pointer and the target were much, much smaller. So it was a pretty challenging task. They're just sort of enlarged here for illustration purposes. And we either gave people just one perspective, that was sort of our individual baseline, or we gave them both perspectives, so orthogonal perspectives, but they were doing the task on their own. And finally, we also had a condition where they were working together and each of them had one of the two perspectives. So we artificially generated these perspectives by rotating the object in different ways. And our primary question was whether two people doing this task together could be as good as an individual with access to both perspectives. And we also wanted to know whether communications or talking about the way you see things would actually help or not. And our hypothesis was that communication in this particular case would not be necessary. And this is also what we found. So we found that, as you can see, people were better in the joint condition and in the individual condition where they had two perspectives. So that's ID, where they had access to the orthogonal perspectives and could switch between them. And they were much worse in a condition where they were working alone from just one perspective. We see no difference between people acting together and people acting alone while having two perspectives. And we also see no effect of communication. So this is a task people can do without communicating. I think the important thing here is that we are asking them to agree. So the task is only finished when they both agree. And we know this is important because we've also run other versions where we did not force people to agree. So everyone could make their judgment independently. And then people are giving some influence to the other's judgment, but it's insufficient. So they don't give appropriate weights to the other's judgment. So you need to force them to agree. So I think that also shows that, yeah, it needs to be a sort of joint action that is pretty joint for these kinds of integration of judgments to work. We also ran an experiment where we didn't give them any feedback. So here, after each trial, they had no idea whether they had done a good job or not. And you can see that the results actually replicate. They're pretty similar. There are some smaller differences when it comes to variability of performance, but here I'm showing you absolute error. So this is really how far were they from the correct judgment. And so here they are still doing a very good job even without feedback. So this is people truly having different visual spatial perspectives. But of course, in joint action, we also sometimes have differences in mental states and need to consider those as we are acting together. So having many interaction partners can imply a need to adapt to multiple individuals, and this in turn may increase perspective taking. And in the study I want to tell you about now, together with Chéri Lefary, we asked whether this might actually improve their communicative ability. So our idea was that if you have to describe something to multiple people, even if you're not getting any feedback about the quality of your description, just the fact that you're repeatedly switching between different perspectives and imagining different addressees might actually make you better at describing something. And I'll go into the mechanisms later, but we thought this could be the case because you're taking a slightly more sort of abstract view on the task and considering it in a more global, in a more holistic way. What we already know, of course, is that having interactions with many different people can help when it comes to input. So we know, for instance, that variability of input from different speakers has positive effects on people's phonological and semantic skills. But here the question is sort of reversed. The question is not, does it help to get a lot of variable input from different people? The question is really, does it help to be interacting with different people and thereby change your own behavior? The task we used was a task where people had to describe these 10-gram chickens. One person saw a set of 6, the other person, the listener, saw a set of 8, and had to figure out which ones the person who was describing the chickens was actually seeing. And in one condition, in the single partner condition, people repeatedly played this game with the same partner. And at the very end, they were playing it with a new partner. In the multiple partners condition, they had a new partner every time. So there were 4 iterations. And then what we did is we recorded their descriptions and we played them to new participants. So we were looking at the quality of their descriptions when a new person is listening to them and has to engage in this task. And what we found is that the accuracy, so people's ability to correctly detect the chickens that were being described, the accuracy was higher for recordings where people had described these chickens to multiple partners compared to a single partner. And just anecdotally, you can see on the left, the sort of length that a description of a poor describer from the single partner condition has, and on the right, a description of a good describer who's coming from the multiple partners condition. And you can see that there is really, a large difference. That's, of course, just an example here. But it seems that switching between partners help people to figure out what is really relevant when you're describing these figures, and to focus on distinctions between the particular chicken rather than going about describing things in a more idiosyncratic way. Now, to get more at the mechanism here, we also ran a memory experiment. So here we asked people, again, to describe these sets. And we told them that there would be a future listener. And in one condition, there were multiple future listeners. So we told them, now describe it for a journalism student, now describe it for a hairdresser, and so on. In the other condition, it was always just one person, so one of those identities. And then after they had engaged in this task describing the chicken, this time it was done by typing on a keyboard. We performed the memory test just to see how well they could remember the sets. So either they saw the original set or they saw a rearranged one. And we found that people who had described the 10 grams for an audience of multiple people had better memory compared to people who always describe these for just one other person. So I think, that there's probably more than one way you can explain this, but the way we think about it is that likely the expectation of multiple dissimilar addressees increased people's tendency to take their addressee's perspective and shifted them to a more global manner of processing. So they may have looked at the whole set, and that would also explain why they're able to remember the whole sets rather than going chicken by chicken and focusing on all the details. So explaining things to multiple people perhaps forced them to take a step back and think about, what's a good way of doing this task. You could also argue that perhaps it triggered more metacognitive processes about how such kind of tasks should be performed. And this already leads me to the last point, which is about increasing cognitive flexibility and abstraction by engaging in joint action. And that's a point that was made by Christian Thülen and collaborators. So this is just something I want to report here because I came across it and found it really interesting, but the credit should go to them. What they were interested in was a question of whether benefits of joint problem solving can be found beyond situations where this has already been described, such as, contributions get accumulated, or you have an increase in working memory resources. So they wanted to ask, what about diversity of task experiences? And again, of course, there's a huge body of work on diversity more generally. Do diverse groups interact in better ways than less diverse groups? And the evidence seems to be mixed. But here they focused on something more specific. They focused on task experience. And their idea was that you get more abstract representations when people with different experiences talk about a particular task. Again, somehow because they need to step back and think about the task as such. And their hypothesis was that this would actually help in some context of problem solving and categorization, where it's important that you uncover a more general principle. So the task they used was a categorization task where people had to categorize aliens into friendly or dangerous. And the correct answer could only be found out through trial and error. And the rule kept changing across the course of the game. So it was a bit like a Wisconsin card sorting test where the rules always change and you need to realize and try and get the new rule. And they thought that participants here would have an advantage if they uncovered the underlying abstract rule. So there was always a local rule, but there was also a more abstract rule that they could uncover, which was that dangerous was always a combination of feature A and feature B or C. There were more features, so they had to understand which features in combination would mean that the alien was dangerous. So you can imagine that playing this task over time might give you some insight into this abstract rule. And their hypothesis specifically was that if you bring people together who've been trained on different rules, it should be easier for them to understand this abstract rule than if you bring people together who've been trained in exactly the same way. And that's also what they found. So the diverse group with training with different rules is the blue line. And you can see that they had a steeper learning slope. And interestingly, they also found that these diverse groups tended to make less perseveration errors as the rules kept changing. So with increasing number of rules, they also had less perseveration, which is indirect evidence that they may have uncovered this more abstract rule. And, I think this is really just a first step, a really, really interesting set of findings. But the principle is really interesting. I think that you could get abstraction through diversity in task experience. Okay, so to conclude, joint actions often lead to joint outcomes that could not be produced alone. And our ability to imagine joint outcomes may play a role in creative activities, but also in problem solving. Second, joint action involves having and also adopting different perspectives. And this may result both in perceptual benefits, but also in communicative benefits. And finally, having diverse task partners, and in particular diverse task experiences, may promote abstraction and also metacognitive processes that could help with problem solving. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks for the whirlwind, fascinating set of studies to review, Natalie. I'm looking through the chat. Looks like Ying had a question that was seconded. Would you like to ask it, Ying?
Yeah, thank you so much for the presentation. It's very interesting, and especially the piano study, it's very creative. I think we have a really nice conversation in the chat. My question is more about when you use EEG, would it be possible to know from the brain, the blood flow perspective in terms of when they make a mistake, like violet, and when other people make mistake violet? Is there any data can capture that? Because I'm really curious about this kind of joint practice, how that's gonna make us feel about our own mistakes, our other people's mistakes, and that leads to regret, that leads to forgiveness. So if anything on that aspect would be very insightful for us to know?
Yes, so I think there are both behavioral and neural markers of actual errors that people make. So for instance, behaviorally, you have something like post-error slowing. People tend to slow down after they have made an error. There's some evidence that people also show this for observation of others' errors. So when someone else has made an error, you also slow down. So it's sort of contagious, if you will. And of course, at the neural level as well, you see sort of particular markers where people respond to the errors, and often it scales with the severity. So as you say, that it could even go to these complex emotions of shame and guilt, right? Where you really feel, oh no, I messed up the whole performance. And certainly, you know, that the intuition is that if a whole group is impacted by your error, it should be a lot worse than if it only affects you as an individual. And I think there are at least a few studies by Janine Leur that actually also, have shown this, that, you know, if the error has an impact for the group, it is sort of treated as something more serious, if you will. Yeah.
So that's great. So I'm just curious whether it be possible to look at the data, looking at the recover, like do you recover faster from other people's mistake? Because usually when people are high performance and perfectionism, they probably take much longer to recover from their own mistakes and then recover from other people's mistakes. I think that data may have some insights, look into the forgiveness. Like if I recover faster, I can move on faster. Maybe I forgive other people, forgive myself faster or slower.
That's interesting. Yeah. And I think often you also see these sort of compensatory processes, so that there are these reports, for instance, of you know, sort of quartets where someone suddenly, you know, cannot see the score anymore, and other people help them along. So I think often people are aware also of the potential of errors, not just the errors that have been made, but the errors that someone else might be making, and then of course try to compensate even ahead of time. And once errors have been made, you have all kinds of repair strategies. And it's an interesting question whether, you know, this sort of recovery is different for self and other.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. I think we have a lot of really good questions from Jenna and Gabrielle in the chat. So I will just stop here. Thank you.
Anybody can dive in as you are so moved. So Natalie, okay, well, Gabrielle.
Oh, sorry,
please.
Go ahead, Rob. It's fine.
No, you, please.
Okay, thank you. So I really enjoyed this because there are a couple things that seem to be at play at the same time, which are the perception of the understanding of what the joint action is, as well as the perception of the understanding of the capabilities of your partner. And so the interplay between those two is what I find the most interesting, as in how you perceive the rules versus how you perceive your partner's ability is going to dictate the nature of the joint action, whether one person picks up the slack or whether both just kind of give up. And so when you showed that perseveration statistic, I was really tuning in, because if we all think about it, when you see games like Family Feud, you kind of see this happening in real time for you. So there are families where if one person gives a really bad answer, everyone's like, oh, it's okay, it's all right. Better next time, you'll do better next time. And then you have the families where they just stare at the other member like, what? And I think some of these reactions are based on our perceptions on how capable we think our partner is. And I don't know if you've ever seen, there's an online show where you have an expert explaining a subject to an elementary school student, a high school student, a college student, and a postdoc. The way they explain things for each level is really based on their perception of the intellect level of the individual. And I think in this situation, for the research that you're presenting, that's the missing piece for me, is how do we quantify the perception of intellect capability, or whatever it is that the person perceives that the other individual has or needs in order to make an effective team. And so I would be curious about how that would be captured, or if it could be captured, because I think that dictates how effective the joint action will be and how lasting and things of that nature.
That's really interesting. I think it's also, perhaps relevant here to distinguish between the teaching context and the sort of joint performance context, because I think in teaching, what good teachers often do is they take you into this sort of zone of proximal development in Vygotsky terms, right? Where they assume perhaps a little bit more than what is actually there, but not too much, right? Just so that you make a real effort and they pull you up. Whereas I think if you're trying to be efficient together, you really need to have a very accurate assessment of your partner's abilities so that you can distribute the task in an efficient way. So I think there may be a difference depending on what kind of goal people have. And I'm just thinking, we recently ran some studies on mental effort and how people share mental effort, because we found that when it comes to physical effort, people are quite good at figuring out who should be contributing how much so that the overall effort for the group is minimized. But when it comes to the mental domain, apparently, this is much more tricky. And we find that, the sort of loafing that you also mentioned can sometimes happen, right? That people, do less than they should be doing. And we need to figure out, is this because they think they're less competent than their partner? Or is it just because they're, lazy or tired and don't want to put in the effort that's required? And ultimately, then, you also get into questions of fairness, of course. What's a fair way of sharing a task? And that, again, may depend also on people's abilities. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So maybe I'll ask a quick question, maybe, Natalie. And I guess I'm curious about how the nature of the interaction between the dyadic members may matter. So like how high bandwidth it is, or how much give and take interaction there is. Because I mean, by one kind of account, you might just say, just being exposed to somebody else's perspective will allow you to have a more abstract view. But I'm guessing that sometimes that's not enough, that sometimes it has to be like this real ongoing negotiation to end up with a better representation.
Yes, that's right. So I think Riccardo Fusaroli's work is also very relevant in that regard. So they actually find that there are situations where it really matters that you find, sort of the same terms for talking about your confidence, for instance. So you really have to be linguistically aligned for people to have a benefit of working together. But I think you're right that there are other situations, including our, sort of Christmas tree study, where it's actually more simple. So, just seeing someone else's judgment and being able to revise it, and perhaps doing that a few times is totally doing the job. So I guess it sort of depends on the problem at hand. But I also feel that that's not a very satisfactory answer, because we should, I think ultimately we want to be able to find out, in which situation is what kind of process of communication or aggregation of judgment, the one that will lead to the best results. And I guess we're not quite there yet.
Okay, well, we're almost on time. Let us segue over to Dr. David Danks, who has also recently moved from CMU to UCSD.
Thanks so much, Rob, and thanks, Natalie. I hope to get close to the bar that you set. Hopefully, this also will not be too much of a tone shift, as I'm not actually going to be presenting empirical cognitive data. Instead, I'm going to be talking a bit more about issues that arise with specifically human-machine interactions and teaming and that sort of augmentation of intelligence when we use algorithms and other kinds of systems to try to augment or enhance our intelligence, whether collective or individual. And I think that one of the challenges is that what we're seeing, certainly in the sort of spaces that that I live in, is a shift over the last couple of years away from thinking about an individual decision maker, perhaps informed by an individual algorithm, where we can treat each of them separately, to recognizing that we really have to think about people and technologies as, in some sense, teams. Now, I'm using that as a shorthand. It should be understood very broadly. I'm not claiming that a decision support algorithm is equivalent to a human in these kinds of things. I think that's one of the things that empirically a lot of people are finding, that algorithms are, for example, not treated exactly the same as a human decision maker would be. Nonetheless, there are now a lot of arguments that we should really focus on human-machine team, human-machine collaboration, not just, figuring out what's going on with this algorithm, figuring out what's going on with this human decision maker, and then, we just kind of plug them together. And I think that this fits really cleanly with the kind of theoretical approach that Natalie was taking, where the joint action is not simply the sum or concatenation of the individual actions. There's something else that we need to think about that goes above and beyond that. Now, alongside this, if you start thinking about teams or collaborations, there is also an increased focus on the outcomes. So if I'm considering a decision support system where I'm trying to decide who to hire, or many of us are in universities, who to admit to graduate school. We're going to use an algorithm to help us make better decisions, that we shouldn't necessarily think about, well, what's the accuracy of the algorithm? Because of course, when that information is handed off to the human, we can have various kinds of distortions, right? So we have to think not about the algorithm's accuracy in isolation or the human accuracy in isolation, but we rather need to think about the overall outcomes, which is to say, what is the, as it were, accuracy of this joint team, of this system, of the overall system. And that, of course, means we have to think about the structures. We can't just think about each individually. We have to think about how do they connect with each other? How do they relate with one another? How are they combined, and how do they interact in order to produce, essentially, in many cases, a joint decision, even if ultimately the human is the one who makes the declaration of, okay, we're going to admit this person, not that person. We're going to hire this person, not that person. It may ultimately be declared by a human, but there is an important sense in which this is or could be a joint decision if the human pays any attention to what comes out of what the algorithm says. The challenge is that what that then means is that if we think about this as sort of a big parameter space for constructing the system, the parameters of the human and the machines aren't and shouldn't be independent of one another. So how we set the machine, how we turn the knobs of our neural net, for example, ought to depend in certain ways on the human, right? If we're going to take this seriously, then we should really be thinking about the collaboration and focusing on the overall outcome. But if we take that stance, it means we have to think about not just the joint activity between humans or joint teaming, we have to think about joint development. How do we develop and estimate the parameters in the case of the machine? How do we develop the system in a way that is respectful of the capacities, capabilities, performance of both the individuals and the ways in which they combine? And I think this leads to a really natural question that is actually fits beautifully with some of the things that were just being talked about at the end of the previous question period, which is when can or when should, right? So distinguishing the descriptive from the normative, and I'll try to address both here. An algorithm, and I mean that it's in scare quotes just because I mean that incredibly broadly, but compensate for human biases. Right. So if we're thinking about, what matters is getting to the right outcome, if the human decision maker has certain biases, well, then we might think, well, let's use the algorithm to compensate for those biases. That's, let's not just have an algorithm, for example, that has a really good F1 accuracy score. Let's have one that is tailored to the particular biases and failure modes of the human. So it seems to me it's a kind of very natural idea. It, I think, is lurking at the heart of the origins of human-computer interaction, is we can't just build a machine, build a human, put them together. We have to think about the interaction. We should think about the interaction in ways that promote the overall outcomes. Right? That in fact, for example, we might want our algorithm, or whatever our software system is, we might be willing to tolerate, for example, reduced performance by some objective measure if it increases performance on exactly the cases that the human's going to tend to get wrong, right? That's a kind of classic way of thinking about this. There are some cases I, as a human decision maker, am going to be very likely to get wrong. And so maybe we could have, the algorithm focus on those cases, even if that comes at some overall cost to accuracy. Now, there's a lot of complexities here. underlying this question, many of which I'm going to try to sidestep. We'll see if I'm successful at that. There are lots of different kinds of biases that humans have. We have cognitive biases, social biases, moral biases, legal biases, layers of biases, more abstract, more concrete, ones connected to affective states rather than cognitive processing, right? So when we ask this question, there's lots of different biases we might be trying to compensate for. We might be more and less confident that people are biased in certain ways. There are lots of ways to adjust an algorithm to compensate for those biases. There are many different use cases, and we might think that the compensation is going to depend some on the context. But I want to try and set those aside because I get 20 to 25 minutes, and so can't dive into every single detail. But I do want to acknowledge those. So I'm going to be painting in a certain sense with a broad brush at times. There are definitely complexities that need to be layered on top of some of these things. But what I want to do first is just step back and return to this core question, which is, if we think seriously, if we really believe that we shouldn't think about the algorithm in isolation and the human in isolation and then just squish the two together and we get a team. If we think about the joint development of a human machine team, then at least it seems possible that there would be conditions in which an algorithm would compensate for human biases, and we should ask questions about when it should. So on the can part, you might think, well, this is kind of a rare thing. This isn't going to come up most of the time. We aren't usually going to have to worry about this question. We can still just develop each individually and put them together because compensation is not going to be that big of a deal. So the first thing I want to say is actually there are many systems in which compensation can occur. And it will occur automatically. It occurs without us, without an explicit decision by a developer to say, okay, I'm going to compensate. So, one mental model you might have of this process is I'm a data scientist. I'm building an algorithm to do hiring decisions. I know that Rob is a horribly biased person. Sorry, Rob. And so I deliberately introduce a skew to my hiring decision support system in order to compensate for the horrible biases that I know Rob has. Okay? It turns out actually you don't need to even have that. These kinds of compensations can happen automatically. Okay, so there's a little bit of jargon here that folks in cognitive science may not know all of it. So a closed loop system, the idea is that you enable the outcome of a decision process to be fed back in automatically as input to your algorithm, right? So you've got let's use a different example. You've got a medical diagnosis system and it generates a diagnosis, and then whether the correctness of that diagnosis is automatically fed back so that you can in real time update your algorithm, right? So these are being viewed as this is what we ought to be moving towards because now we can deal with non-stationary, constantly changing dynamic worlds where we don't want to have our algorithm just get set in stone. We want it to track as the world shifts around us, right? So closed loop systems are frequently being touted as this is where we should go. This is the future of machine learning. If you use a reinforcement learning algorithm, so that's the RL there, it's just standard reinforcement learning, think classical conditioning. So reinforcement learning as a generalized, sophisticated version of old school Rescorla-Wagner, for those who know that. If you've got a closed loop system where the algorithm is a reinforcement learner and there's a human decision making, you will get a compensatory algorithm. That reinforcement learning algorithm will learn to compensate for whatever the biases are of the human decision maker. So with no explicit or conscious introduction of compensation by a developer, you do what is often touted as best practice for complex dynamical systems, and you will automatically get compensation, right? So we can't dodge this question of when do compensatory algorithms happen? It's not a rare thing. A different kind of case is if you have coordinated activities. This goes back in certain ways to some of the things that Natalie was talking about. Imagine that you have the duet being played by a robot and by a human. Okay. If there are coordinated activities with mostly aligned incentives, right? So yes, I want the duet to be successful, but I also want to make sure I'm not the one who messed it up, right? So there's a slight misalignment of the incentives. Actually, in these cases, in the mathematical sense, in almost all contexts, you will get compensation, right? Essentially, the robot will learn to adapt to my idiosyncrasy that, my pinky doesn't reach quite as far on my right hand. So in the duet, I'm going to be slightly delayed on that. It will learn to compensate for me. It will adjust its performance to be suboptimal. It will delay its pressing of the key in order to coordinate with me. Right? And I deliberately picked that example because I think it's important to see this is, both of these are showing compensation is not a bad thing, right? It actually seems like an awfully good thing in many cases to have the algorithm compensate for the human biases and failures in certain sorts of ways. You can also show that if the human and machine are actually playing a sequential game, so now it's not just a decision support system, but rather they're taking turns taking action, so a turn-taking thing. Frequently, the Nash equilibrium of the sequential game will involve compensation by the algorithm to adjust for the human biases, whether known or unknown, right? So the point of this slide is just to say, when I first started thinking about compensatory algorithms, my thought was, oh, yeah, I mean, this is kind of a cute thing, but how often is this really going to happen? And what I've now become convinced of, and hopefully in 3 minutes here convinced you of, is this is actually an ordinary thing. I, as somebody who actually does machine learning in addition to cog-sci, I can't avoid thinking about this. It is part of what I'm engaged in when I'm building systems. And at least if I take seriously this intuition that we have to think about the collaborative team, not just the algorithm in isolation. Thanks, Orca. All right, so if these things are happening all the time, if they are a serious problem we have to consider, well, now I want to put on my philosopher's hat, and I want to ask about the ethics of it, which is to ask, when is it ethically required versus permissible versus forbidden that we can, to use compensation, okay? Now, I first want to suggest that there are contexts within compensation can be ethically required, permitted, or forbidden. Okay, so it is not that we can have any blanket declaration about the ethics of compensatory algorithms. So as an example of one where I would argue that it is required, if we think about, for example, the design of algorithmic support and interfaces for high consequence tasks, think here, flying airplanes. And here I think this is an intuition that goes back to the early days, the 1960s, of human factors research. But now updated to a world of algorithms and AI, where we say, look, there are certain tasks that, I'm sorry, if we know that the human is biased in certain ways, we have to compensate for it because the stakes are too high. If we know that the human pilot is going to misperceive some information that's coming in, then we actually have an obligation to have the algorithm provide them, in some sense, whatever information is needed to ensure appropriate action by the human. Now, we can argue about this. I'm happy to talk about it in questions, but I think there are high consequence tasks where it's actually morally required because the outcome is sort of the thing we really have to make sure we get right. And if we can't, I mean, obviously, if we could adjust the human, that would be great. But as we all know, there are certain biases, cognitive, perceptual, ethical, that are very resistant to change, I'll say it that way. And in those cases, I think there's actually an obligation for me to compensate in my algorithm. I think if we think about standard HCI, human-computer interaction, I think most of those cases are cases where it's permissible. So if I know that people are going to have a cognitive bias to over-represent rare events, they're going to, overweight them as more important. If I'm in one of those contexts where we get overweighting of rare events rather than underweighting of them, I think it's perfectly permissible for me to design the interface of my system to, make the rare events look actually a little more rare than they really are, make them look even rarer than they actually are, so that it offsets this expected known bias. It's not required, right? I don't think, if we're dealing with sort of a standard HCI thing, people might make slightly worse decisions. Maybe they learn over time. If we're not talking about flying an airplane, I think it's morally permissible. It's probably not required to do this. I hesitate to say that that the data scientist has done something wrong if they fail to have the algorithm compensate for the fact that people might overweight rare events in their decision-making, if it's a relatively low stakes case. I also think there are cases that are forbidden. So here's a kind of example. Probably many of you on this call have an Apple Watch. You might use it to track your steps. You might update your health information, including, say, things like your weight. I think it would be forbidden for Apple to decide that if your weight exceeds a certain amount, if it's gone up a certain amount over time, that the step tracking app will now lie to you about how many steps you've done, so that you've done 10,000 steps, but it tells you 8,000 to try and get you to do those extra 2 because you really ought to lose weight. I think would be forbidden. I think that that's morally not okay. I think that that is an extreme infringement upon people's autonomy to do this in a way that this is not ethically permissible. But notice that is a kind of compensation, right? That's a way of compensating for people's, in this case, probably sort of motivational bias that, they just don't want to do as many steps as they might need to or something like that, right? I'll note that you can imagine tweaks to some of these that start to change it a little bit. What if I could ask the watch to lie to me? Would it then be okay if I consented to it? I think that's an interesting case to consider. It's sort of analogous to when we ask a friend or a spouse to change our alarm clock, the clock at the bedside, move it forward by a little bit so that I can show up on time to things. But don't tell me how much you moved it forward, because if you did, then I'll be able to compensate for it back, right? So, there are these kinds of cases. I want to consider a different difficult case because this is one that we've been working on and I think brings a lot of really difficult issues to the fore. And I want to present it and then give a quick overview of sort of where we are right now in terms of having to think about the ethics of these kinds of compensatory algorithms. And the difficult case is, what if I'm building a diagnostic AI system that's going to be deployed in a hospital where I have good historical evidence that there are racist racially biased health outcomes in the past with this hospital. So I know that patients of color are disproportionately likely to be undertreated, to have adverse health outcomes. And yet, what I'm working with is I also have sort of biomedical knowledge, right? And I think this brings to the fore this very idea of compensation, right? So on the one hand, if I'm just trying to build an accurate algorithm, historically, I think most people would have thought, yeah, you should build the thing that says, here's what the biomedical risk is. But the actual health risk in this context is not the biomedical risk. It's the biomedical risk within this contextual structure. And so if you really think that what matters are outcomes, then it seems that I should, if I'm the data scientist, develop a diagnostic AI support system that overstates the risk to patients of color in order to get whether explicitly or implicitly, consciously or unconsciously, racist doctors and health professionals to do the right thing. That, we're going to suppose that these are folks that if I tell them this person's really sick, they're going to treat them. It's just, when they see two people that are judged to be equally sick, the white patient is the one who gets the treatment, not the patient of color, right? That's a very common thing, especially here in the United States. So should I overstate the risk? In the sense of now overstate is a weird thing to say here, of course, because I'm overstating it biomedically. But given the history of adverse outcomes being disproportionately occurring in patients of color, I'm not overstating it. They really are at greater risk. On the other hand, this, to keep the complexities going, as one person said when I gave this example, they said, oh, you want to replace philosopher kings with data scientist queens, right? There seems to be this sort of, this idea that I as a data scientist am going to say, I know better. I'm going to skew your medical judgment in order to try to bring about the outcomes that I think are the right ones. Seems very uncomfortable for a lot of people. Right. The idea that the arguments that are pro-compensation is that health outcomes are what matters, and the algorithm should output whatever it needs to output. Right. If we close the loop on this diagnostic system and use a reinforcement learner, it will learn actually to predict greater risk for patients of color because they in fact are at greater risk based on the outcomes. Right. So who cares that my algorithm is inaccurate as long as it gets the right outcomes for the patients? course, the anti-outcome is, you're lying to your doctors. I mean, so to what extent should we be concerned about the algorithm, in essence, lying to the doctors? They think it's giving them one kind of information, and it's giving them a different kind. Because, of course, if we tell the doctors, oh, by the way, this is skewed to overstate the risk, that's going to certainly undo at least some of the compensatory benefit. And, I think there are a lot of other cases that involve this sort of combination of deception and non-consent, right? So the doctors aren't going to agree to have this compensatory algorithm used. We need to deceive them. I mean, yes, we'd get some benefits because of anchoring effects, but we probably wouldn't get the full benefits if they knew they were being deceived. And so what ought we do here in practical terms, right? If I'm teaching data science students who might be going off to work at a hospital in a data analytics group, what should I tell them that they should do? I'll note, we're all starting to see the emergence, for example, of things that help to grade student papers. That's another case where this comes up, and it's one that hits close to home for many of us. We know that there are various biases in the grading of student papers. We also want to use AI to help grade because it's really unpleasant when you get 80, 15-page papers and you have to grade them quickly. And so should the system recognize, oh, this student is using a particular dialect variant in English that professors generally implicitly downgrade because it's viewed as less intellectual. And so I, as grade scope or whatever, am going to overscore it and score it as a better paper than it really is because I know the professor is going to be biased against it. Right. So this isn't, I mean, these actually shows up in a lot of different cases. I gave this difficult one, but I think this is a case that a lot of us are going to be wrestling with in our professional lives in universities. So, all right, so let me suggest quickly how we're thinking about it right now and explain why I don't know that it's going to work. This is, in this sense, work in progress. So we think that one way of thinking about this is that an algorithm can offer compensating output to the human if, first of all, the developer has justified beliefs about the biases, right? If you can't compensate just because you think people might be awful, you need to have some kind of justification about the nature and extent of the biases. It should be that compensation is sort of the only feasible mechanism, especially if we're in a situation where we have to be deceptive about the compensation. If we could just teach bias out of people, or if we could set up other kinds of institutional structures that would eliminate, for example, the racially biased health outcomes in the hospital, then it's very hard to see the argument for deception. I mean, this is kind of a standard position in ethics, which is you ought not lie to people unless that sort of is the only way to achieve the outcome. There is some other way we should do that. We have to worry about the compensation being minimal. And I think if I sort of am tracking a little bit about some things going by in the chat, there's a big worry here if discovery of the deception is likely, right? So if doctors discover that they are being lied to, then the whole system collapses and we lose all of the benefits of it. And so there's an interesting sort of decision theoretic question of how do you balance the benefits of the deception against the this sort of known benefits of the deception against the risky, uncertain possibility of discovery and disclosure. That's a significant worry. So at the very least, we think it's important not to have really large compensation, which gets a little bit tricky in the closed loop scenario. Happy to talk about that in questions. And then this is the one that people get the most concerned about. It's also the longest text, so maybe that should be a signal that it's not, we haven't figured it out exactly yet, but that we think that it needs to be the case that there is an expectation that the impacted individuals who are not necessarily the users here would consent to the compensation if they knew it were occurring. So in this case, in the case of the diagnosis, the diagnostic AI, we do not think that you need to have consent from the doctors to deceive them. Right? That's actually not the relevant thing, because the relevant values that the diagnostic AI is supposed to be supporting are the values of the patients. So the question is, would patients consent to their doctor being lied to if they knew that that was a way to try to compensate for the perhaps unconscious, perhaps structural biases of their doctor. Okay. Now, this is epistemically a remarkably high bar, right? It's hard to think about. It's going to be a very difficult thing to know and to have those justified expectations. So I think where we are right now is that there's probably a kind of default bias against doing deceptive compensation, because it's going to be very rare that you're going to actually know. But, you know, you could imagine doing a large-scale survey of college students and asking, you know, if there were a risk that a professor were biased against certain students, would you want the automated grading system to lie to the professor in order to, you know, overstate things? So I think that that's a big issue. You'll note that a lot of this, I'm not going to have time to go into this, but a lot of this is closely connected to issues of and questions of paternalism, and the various ways in which, you know, obviously in a strong paternalism, some individual simply makes a decision on behalf of each of others. There's the sort of nudge style kinds of softer forms of paternalism where people, where decisions are probabilistically shifted through the construction of a particular decision environment, choice architecture. So, you know, there's a lot of different pieces coming together. I think the takeaways that I was hoping to get people thinking about is, of course, that it's really easy to say, oh, we shouldn't just focus on algorithm accuracy and isolation. We have to think about how it gets used with humans. And I think often that kind of rhetoric gets thrown around without an appreciation for just how much you have to rethink everything you're doing in light of it. It's not a trivial, oh, just glue the two together and we're done. Or just talk to a cognitive scientist and you're done if you're on the data science AI side. There are novel challenges that arise. At the same time, I think we have to acknowledge, if we take that seriously, then we have to consider compensation and compensatory algorithms, because they do improve team performance. And a lot of people are actively working on how to have them better improve team performance. But then we have to consider a lot of ethical questions, especially around issues of deception and paternalism, and when it is permissible to use compensation, perhaps in some sense against the explicit wishes of the users of these algorithms who are ultimately making the decisions. So I'm sorry I don't have, you know, hard and fast, deep answers, but hopefully this has posed a number of questions. And thanks to people, especially Nandini Swaminathan. She's been incredibly helpful in a lot of this, but others have also been willing to talk to me about it. So thanks.
Great. Thanks, David, for the very provocative talk. Excellent talk. The provocative nature is illustrated well by the amount of discussion that's over to the side.
I wasn't able to keep up with that, I noticed.
So I'm going to ask people like, I don't know, like Sina and Jenna and Gabriella and Stephen, just to dive right in, not necessarily in that order, but Sina, why don't you begin though? No,
I think Gabriella began to say something, so I will
that's good
let
too.
Gabriella please go first.
Yeah.
Oh, that was Gina. Sorry.
Everyone's too nice today.
I'll go ahead because thank you, Gabriella. It was me that unmuted. I am just going through the algorithm, and I think it's a good thing for us to consider whether we're lying to people when we're adding compensatory parts to an algorithm. But I would like to put forth the idea that if there's actually a relationship there, then it's not a lie. If I have two patients who have the same, let's say, influenza symptoms, and there's actually data to support that the patient who's a person of color is at a higher risk from dying from this disease than the white patient, then I would suggest that adding that as a variable isn't lying to the users, because it's it's not a biomedical variable per se, but it is an input that has a marked impact on the output of this decision process. So I think it's good for us to keep in mind that there's an ethical question around lying to people, but there's also a counterpoint to that of, if I know that a professor is going to grade a paper more harshly because it's written in African American vernacular English instead of scientific English, then there should be some compensation for that. And it doesn't mean that I'm lying to the professor. It means that I'm considering outputs in addition to those that are tied directly to the decision.
Yeah, I mean, I think those are great points, and we've definitely struggled with some of the language of, do we use the language of lie and this kind of thing. I think one of the big challenges is, in many of these contexts, the algorithms are being presented and advocated for on the grounds that they can detect objective patterns that are not supposed to be, in some sense, super context sensitive. So people lobby for them precisely on the grounds that they are not going to be, that you can take the same algorithm and use it in San Diego and use it in Pittsburgh and use it in London, because what it's really getting at is the underlying risk. And then, of course, the doctor can exercise their medical judgment to think about what are the available resources, what treatments might be appropriate. So that's the sort of framing that is often given to these, or we're going to give an objective, I don't like using that word for various reasons, but we're going to give an objective grade that then the faculty member might be able to adjust based on their understanding of what was discussed in class. So there is a tension between the idea that these are supposed to be highly context sensitive and they're supposed to be highly objective and not context sensitive. So I agree that one response is to say, no, look, they really are telling us the risk to these patients. It's not a lie. But in practice, that's going to mean that in many hospitals, et cetera, the ways that people talk about diagnostic AIs, the very way that they are just talked about is going to have to radically change. So that we're going to need a change in some kind of practice. And I think that there's at least an open discussion to be had about which one is the better way to go. But I agree with you. There is a path where we recognize these aren't lies. These people are at greater risk, and we should tell the doctors they're at greater risk. We just need to be clear that it's not an objective measure in the sense that it's purely based on the biomedical facts, which is how they're usually presented.
I think that's a good point. There's definitely a tension there, and trying to balance that is tricky. Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, David. I mean, we've had this conversation and we'll continue to have this conversation. So when you were talking, I was wondering, kind of, again, we had this, but to what extent is this really distinct from ethics of nudging? Because I see that in some cases that you discuss, we are kind of trying to steer individuals from towards an outcome that we think is valuable, but is distinct from their revealed preferences. But it seemed that in all of those cases, like the cases of doctor, we are steering them towards outcomes that ought to be their preferences given their professional roles, right? Even if it's not their individual thing. And so in those cases, it seemed that kind of the ethics of compensation and ethics of nudging kind of very closely match each other. So that's one thing. And then the second thing was that one of the issues that comes up in ethics of nudging is the issue of short versus long-term desirability of it, where some argue that in the long term, this actually does not undermines rationality, for instance. And here I can also see that, sure, we ask students whether they prefer their instructors to be compensated for their biases, but it would be strange if the instructors don't learn about this and try to somehow get involved in a way that actually makes the intervention very fragile, I suppose, in the long term. So yeah, these two things kind of, to what extent is it distinct from ethics of nudging? And then the second one is that what type of short versus long-term tensions do you see in these type of cases?
Yeah, so taking them in reverse order, you know, as I mentioned, there's this, the risk of discovery, the risk of loss of trust in the system, the risk of unwillingness to use the system as a result of that. I will freely confess, I don't have a deep answer beyond those things have to be weighed. It's going to be incredibly context sensitive how to balance those. And I don't know that we have clear principles at the current time. You know, I can construct a scenario where the chance of discovery is so slim, and so we really just ought to do this because they're probably never going to know. I can construct a scenario where we start to have, you know, other kinds of negative long-term feedback loops. If patients of color see the AI system, they go, "Oh my God, I had no idea I was so sick," right? You know, they might see their own chart, and all of a sudden they're now having, you know, because we know that there are these kinds of feedback loops. If you believe you are sicker, then you actually manifest more symptoms, right? So, so there's these kinds of issues also. At which point it's starting to run into a level of complexity that, I mean, maybe there's a kind of precautionary principle at play here, which is, okay, don't do this, right? Because the risks are going to be so indeterminate that you're never going to know if the balance is in favor of this. So it might, you know, there might be a kind of principle that comes from it. I'm not there yet because I, you know, in general, don't like hard and fast principles, but I think that certainly is a good point. Now, in terms of your question of, well, isn't this just, in some sense, isn't this just nudging, right? Isn't this just nudging via algorithm rather than nudging via choice architecture, say, or information presentation? I do think that there's an important difference that the individual being nudged is not the individual whose values are being supported by the nudge, if we think of it in that way. I agree with you that we're dealing with people where the professional value, the professional ethics dictate that somebody else's values should be taken on by me, right? So when I am a doctor, the patient's health is supposed to be the value I take on, and I subordinate my personal values to that one, right? We also know that that's not actually what happens. We know that doctors' personal values, autonomy, expertise, and so forth, continue to play a role. So at least empirically, I do think that there's an important difference here, that when the one being nudged is not the values that are relevant for the compensation are not identical with the values of the individual who is being compensated for, who's being nudged in that sense. And I think there's a difference there that's meaningful. The other thing that I think is different is that normally when people talk about nudges, they're very careful in almost all cases I know about, that they don't present misleading information. They might present selected information. They might present information in a particular order, but they wouldn't tell you that this sandwich has 900 calories when it actually has 600. That's viewed as off the table for most people who do nudges. But that's the sort of thing that's on the table here. That if I look and say, you know what, I mean, lots of people have done studies of the relatively small impacts of menu information. You know, and that there's these weird backfire effects where I see that thing only has 400 calories and I think, oh, great, I can have 2 of them. And these kinds of things. And so I end up with more calories. We've seen, you know, good studies about these. You know, I think an implication of what we're suggesting is actually, you know, we shouldn't be saying it has 4. We should tell people that it's 700. Right? That's a kind of implication of this view that I think is I think most people who work on nudges would say, no, you can't do that. And so that, I think this goes beyond nudges in that respect also, which is part of why I'm so much more hesitant about it.
Great, thanks.
Okay, so I wasn't going to ask a question, mostly because most of my issues have been raised, but also because I had root canal 2 hours ago. But it's, I enjoyed your talk nevertheless, David. It was great and inspiring. I'll try to make it short because I don't think Natalie's been asked any questions yet. Let me just quickly make a bold claim that deception is never a good idea. And, you know, whether it seems to me that you can always get away with not lying to people. It depends exactly what you're saying to the doctors or, you know, the person you're speaking to. Like, you want to say something about risk. Well, there are a million ways to say something about risk, and you can say it in a way that's true, or you can say it in a way that's false. So I don't believe that, you know, there's really a question about whether you're lying or not. So 2 case studies, neither having to do with algorithms, but nevertheless, I think informative. One, the CDC decided to compensate for the desire to make more masks available to medical staff at the beginning of the pandemic. And as a result, a lot of people don't believe what the CDC says anymore, right? So you frame this as, well, if disclosure is a possibility, then we have to be careful. My feeling is disclosure is almost guaranteed in the long run, right? Second example, behavioral economics labs will not join forces with psychology labs because they don't allow deception.
Right.
So it's not clear what the answer to that is, but behavioral economists or economists in general have taken the position that there shall be no deception in the context of my lab, because I just don't want to have I don't want people to think about us that way. I don't want people to consider that a possibility in this context. And it seems to me that's a really good principle to live by.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just very quickly say, because I want to be mindful of time and work is next. Also, I agree with many of the sentiments that you're expressing. I also run into the response that I also feel the pull of what Jenna said, which is, this isn't a lie. These people really are at greater risk of death. These papers really are better than I will think they are. Right. And so there's some interesting questions about essentially the semantics of the output of the algorithm. What does it mean, and what do we tell people it means? That I think some kinds of compensation may not actually involve, they could involve in some sense implicit deception, right? I mean, now I start to worry, is this deception of the form, how did the students do on the exam? Some of them passed, when in fact all of them, right? So I say something, it's not false, I didn't lie to you, but yet I know exactly what inference you're going to have drawn, namely that some of them didn't pass. I don't yet have a clear view of how to think about the ethics of that kind of deception. When I say things, knowing exactly that you will infer something wrong from it, but I'm not actually the one saying anything wrong.
Interesting. Thanks.
Is that I think it's me?
Yep.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of follow up with a point that I already raised in the chat. So which is really about how to build a robust or resilient system, right? And there it just seems to me, ethics aside, that you're going to have a stronger, more robust system if you're dealing with the problem where it actually arises, right? So if the problem is with the user, doesn't seem to me a great idea to kind of fix it by pretending that the data are different or the objective reality is different from what it is. I need to kind of fix the user, which leads on to this thing that you just raised about what the system actually communicates, right? I don't think it would be in any way problematic, for example, in the medical case, if the system alerted me as a user and said, by the way, I noticed that this is an African-American patient, and in your hospital, outcomes for these patients in equivalent circumstances to other patients are worse. You might want to keep an eye on that, right? But it's not altering how it represents the reality. It's actually presenting me with the underlying reality in that case and drawing my attention to it. And made me wonder whether there's an additional dimension in what you're talking about, which is imagine different teams, and I think teams exist of human machine interaction that differ in the allocation of responsibility. One the one end being sort of an advice system like medical, very much the doctor making, but being presented some information. And for example, maybe some system around some undersea, right, where there are a human and a machine together.
I've now fully lost Ulrika.
I asked her to talk slowly.
And now she's dropped. Should I wait to see if she signs back in, or should I just answer the question? I mean, I'll just quickly say, I mean, I think, sure, we want to fix biases where they occur. We also know that there's a lot of human psychological biases, social, cognitive, moral, that are incredibly resistant to change. So we might not be able to fix them where they occur. I think there's also interesting challenges about what are my obligations as a data scientist. If I know these biases exist, they have been persistent for long periods of time. If I just go, well, not my job, I get really worried when people start using that sort of, well, it's not my job to fix it, it's someone else's job. And I can't fix it, I'm just building an algorithm. I can't go and, mandate training for the doctors. There's a worry that I'm thereby becoming complicit with it's not in my purview. So therefore I'm not responsible. I think there's real concerns about that here. Now there's also concerns about overreach that I go, ooh, I'll fix that problem when I shouldn't be. But it makes me think, yes, we want to fix the biases where they occur. I think that's not always possible, either because there's resistance to the fix or it's not within my purview.
So similar to what Stephen was saying, it might be great if people now would broaden their perspective to loop back in Natalie's talk. Does anybody have a question that would masterfully bridge David and Natalie's talk?
Well, I have a question, if I'm allowed to ask one of Natalie, which is, in the studies that you've done looking at joint human-human action, do you see people doing any sort of, do you see this sort of compensatory behavior? I mean, when I think about playing a duet with people, you absolutely are sort of thinking, all right, I know they always are a little late on that one, so I'm just going to delay me just a little because I know they always mess that up. Do you see that empirically, though, in the studies, or is that just anecdote?
No, absolutely. We did a study where we specifically asked people to compensate. So we had a combination of experts and novices playing the piano, and we asked the experts to adjust to the novices. And what we did is we built in difficulties for the novices that from an expert point of view are just no difficulties at all. So they had to move their hand from one place to another. For an expert, this is absolutely nothing, but for novice, it actually takes time. And so we could look at the extent to which the experts would actually take the perspective of the novice. And we looked at, does it make a difference whether we give them experience so they listen to the novice, or is it important that they get the score? And actually both can make a contribution. It sort of seems like for the bigger disruptions, it's good to have the score because that reminds them, oh, now I need to adjust. So it's something more explicit. But for the smaller deviations where, the novices are just sort of idiosyncratic in their timing, it actually helps experts to have this auditory experience. So if they listen to them playing for a while, they create something like an error matrix where I think they have an idea of when they would hit the note, when they would hit the key, and when the other person is doing that. So they build up a model for the other, and that allows them to compensate. And I think related to that, I always had a sort of strange feeling about that study because I felt that we were doing something slightly strange. We're asking the expert to compensate so that the performance is very smooth. And, the experience of a novice then might actually be, oh, I'm not so bad at this. And, oh, I can already play a piano duet with an expert. But really, there is something deceptive there in a way, right? Because you're not giving them the full learning experience. And I think that this could be sort of also where the connection perhaps is to the ethical issues that you raised. So I can totally see the point that you want to, evoke some change and not just say, oh, this is out of my purview. But at the same time, you sort of I think there's a danger of depriving people of learning opportunities, right? Because these doctors will not have an idea of the bias that they have or their hospital has, and we're not doing, enough perhaps to make them aware of it if we just apply the compensation. So I guess perhaps it raises a more general question of, also how people perceive the interaction with themselves and another, human or computer partner or algorithm. Do they see this as a team? Or do they see this more as individual decisions that are aided by others? And that could also make a difference. Maybe that's my question back to you. Do you think there could also be these kinds of framing effects that depending on what you tell a user about the algorithm and about how they're supposed to work together, would they sort of use the input differently?
Yeah, I mean, my immediate reaction is that yes, if you frame this as, depending on how an algorithm's output is framed, is it an expert? Is it a representation of the past data? Is it giving you a starting point? That framing does seem to influence how people use the algorithm output in their decision making. And that's a really great point. I mean, I hadn't thought carefully about how that's yet another knob to be turned that is obviously not about either individual, but is about the joint. So that's a really great point. Thanks.
Thank you both. I had a thought that I wanted to see if we could draw a connection between your two presentations. And I want to thank the larger group. I really appreciate discussions like this where there's a lot more open-ended and new ways to look at things, and it's hard to pin down an exact answer. I had asked Natalie in the chat about the experience of musicians who have played with each other for a long time. I've had that personally, where I've had duet partners that I played with for years, and it gets to the point where there's a really almost like a hive mind effect, where instead of being two separate musicians, you sort of become one musician when you're playing together, because you're so used to each other that you can really anticipate things. And David, you talked about the idea of closed loop and reinforcement learning. And I wonder how much of an overlap there could be there as humans are spending time with these algorithms, whatever level of understanding they have about what the algorithm is doing, and how that might relate to the way that musicians or groups of musicians can spend time together and become more effective over time as a group, or if they create a self-feeding feedback loop in the negative sense from music, where it creates its own issues.
Yeah, I mean, I think one challenge in the field right now, thinking about the human AI collaboration, human-centered AI, whatever term one prefers, one challenge is that we don't actually have very many studies where people work with systems for weeks and months on end. You're lucky if somebody works with the system for 20 minutes, and that's the extent of most of the experimental work. And so, yeah, I think that's a really good open question, is how much do people, I think everyone would predict that the humans would learn to adapt and adjust to the algorithm. We have a lot of evidence that would probably happen. What happens when the algorithm can adapt to the human, and how much coevolution do we get is, there are other folks in the call who might know things I'm not thinking of, but I think that's a pretty open question. There's been some work, but not enough to feel like we have clarity about it.
I guess related to this, there's also the question of challenging each other, right? Because we sort of work on the assumption that it's good to be aligned, and the more we've been together, the more we can be in unison. But, I think there are also contexts where it's important that you sort of, ask each other for justifications, right? And you challenge each other. And I think perhaps that's also something not to lose sight of. I don't know how it would be implemented in a sort of person algorithm interaction, but certainly in human interaction, it's for instance, something you would see in at least sort of, creative contexts where people improvise. It's not always about, being aligned. It's also about creating challenges for each other. And then, of course, if you overcome those, perhaps it creates even more bonding and unison eventually. But it's perhaps also an interesting question what that would translate into in David's domain.
Does somebody want to have the final question, final word? I see Marina does.
Thanks, Rob. Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on things that people have been raising over the last maybe 15 minutes. So it seems like many challenges that David brings up are tied to the framing that in the system of machine algorithm, there's a superior actor that is a human being, which we need to think about if we need to lie to them or not. And of course, like both of the parts of the system are going to adapt to each other. So if you lie to a human, humans will adapt to this lie, and then the machine could possibly adapt back, and so on and so forth. But then all the challenges, all the ethical challenges arise with treating human being as a somewhat superior actor in that decision-making machine. Similarly, in Natalie's case, if we would take some sort of this framing, we could think of, is it good for musicians to start playing a wrong in the wrong tune just to adapt for someone else playing in the wrong tune as well? So I was wondering, in which situations do we want to treat some parts of the system as superior, and in which situations do we want to treat the whole team as a team of equal players which could adapt to each other just to achieve the overall goal, and it doesn't matter if they lie to each other or compensate to each other in any way? Yeah, just to, if you could elaborate on that.
Yeah, I mean, we've been focusing on the case where the human decision maker sort of has the final word, partially because there's a very, there are many contexts in which there are lots and lots of arguments that that's really important. So especially when you look at work on sort of what responsible AI, meaningful human control is a frequent phrase that you hear, that there's got to be a human who has, that we have the context awareness, we understand the values, we can adapt in ways that the system cannot. So it's actually crucial that a human always has the final say. So, I mean, I think I think the demands for that are only going to increase over time. So I agree, there are other kinds of structures that could be considered. They just, empirically aren't happening in the kind of context that I end up working on and worrying about. Maybe they should, but there are, political, legal, probably ethical reasons that in things like healthcare, transportation, and others, it would be helpful. We kind of don't have a choice. We're going to have to accept this, at least in the near term. So that's why I focused on that, but I agree. Things change if you don't have it as the algorithm as a feeder to a human decision maker.
Okay, so there's lots of great stuff going on in the chat, and I'm feeling bad that it's going to go away to everybody except for myself and Marina. So I would be interested in people's suggestions about what to do about these chat logs. Okay, but we are out of time, so let's thank our speakers, Natalie and David, and we'll be back next week. Thanks.
Thank you. Have a nice day.